scribe and a note taker.
I can take notes.
Thank you. Need a jobber scribe. Thank you. What?
Jonathan slides.
Yeah.
Did you?
No, I gave him a stick.
Oh, okay. Fine. That's a fine way to do it.
What can I do, right?
It's reasonable.
Okay. Thank you. When I get this thing going, I'll post them. All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and get started. Put the chair slides up. So this morning, Brian Rosen has agreed to substitute or pinch hit for Robert Sparks, who couldn't be here. Thank you. He's bringing up the chair slides.
There you go.
Okay. So, didn't I have a note well too? Yeah. Okay. So remind you of the note well. This is different than previous meetings, but probably the same as you've seen all week. The big addition from my brief scan is the privacy statement at the bottom. Okay. Moving on to the agenda. Is there any agenda bashing? We have first documents that have already been sent to the ISG that we need to briefly talk about, then the active working group documents, and then other business as time allows. Okay, no bashes. Moving on. Then Martin, I think you're the presenter for the RPH. Okay.
Okay, good morning. Next slide, please.
He's trying to get into full screen still.
Okay, okay, so this is a status update. The passport extension for resource priority header, authorization provides a passport extension to convey cryptographically signed assertion of authorized communications, signing the resource priority header. This is for priority services such as government priority services, NSEP, National Security Emergency Preparedness, civil emergency 911, as well as public safety in the U.S., FirstNet, and as well as what's being deployed here in the UK. Draft 00, now going back, there was a question raised on the list with respect to ordering. And with respect to ordering an RPH, well, first of all, RPH only has one claim. The compact form of the passport is not specified, /supported. And there is an example of, the syntax, in the document, where the claim is, RPH. Draft 00 was presented in IETF 99, 01 presented in IETF 100. Okay, so we had working group chair comments, which from Russ and Robert, and thank you very much for that. And those have been addressed. We had AD comments. Adam, thank you very much. And those also have been addressed. How those comments have been resolved are in the backup slides. I'm not going to go through those today, but we did receive confirmation from the commenters that their comments were addressed. Next slide. Okay, next steps. Adam stated that the IETF last call will occur after IETF 101. We noticed this week that the document has been elevated to the telechat. And so that is the status of the document. Questions, comments?
Hi, John Peterson. So I have a slide about this actually when I'm talking about divert, I think. There is a clerical ambiguity that is entirely my fault that's in RC 8224 about whether or not the values of the PPT equals an identity header should be quoted or not. And we just basically have it as like, oh, well, the value in the ABNF is token, but then in other parts of the document, we imply it should be quoted. So I think we need to clarify that. You have it unquoted in yours. I have it quoted in like all of the other extension things that we're doing. We should have one way of doing it. So I may, as a last call comment, depending on the consensus around this here, I might suggest that we at least all be aligned on that. This is like a really tiny, like 2-character thing, but I just happened to note this near draft and I thought I'd mention it.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you.
Put this on time.
Yeah, good deal.
What's next?
Chris, you're next with Passport Shaken. He has no slides.
Yeah, so for Passport Shaken, I sent to the list a few editorial fixes based on some comments Krista had provided. Maybe the biggest thing is adding a section specific to order, just to clear up that confusion. But otherwise, I've had a few trickle of comments, but I think, for the most part, we're ready to go. Unless there's any other specific comments.
Did everyone have a chance to look at the one paragraph where Chris provided the list of changes that were made? Does anyone have any concerns moving forward based on that? Okay, hearing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, you're up on divert.
Thank you. I'm going to talk more today about divert than OOB. So just to the chairs, if we run over 10 minutes on this, I think it's okay because I have like very little to say about OOB today.
Okay.
But we have a lot to say about divert because I'd like to try to get this done because everybody seems to want it.
If you bracket the 20 between the two, that's fine.
Sounds good. Okay, next slide. For those of you just joining us, what is divert and why are we doing this? What is it for? A lot of people have asked about this, about how we handle some of these retargeting cases where the 2-header field of ZIP is signed by Passport, but some retargeting entity in the middle of the network actually changes the 2 as you go through. And this can even arise actually in some cases where they don't even change the 2, but you just have received through the network an invite that was originally to somebody that has a URI that you just don't recognize. It doesn't seem to be you. How are you supposed to understand securely that this wasn't a cut and paste attack, that somebody like plugged in from an invite that they captured that was in fact going to somebody else? So we created this divert Passport extension, has its own PPT, div for divert. And basically it does a function similar to what the diversion header originally INSIP did and to history info in some respects. But remember, because of the way we do canonicalization in STIR, very, kind of cosmetic changes to the URI, even changing like the entire host portion of a URI that has a telephone number in the user part, doesn't require you to generate a new passport. So in fact, it is much more conservative in terms of how many times you would need to include a diversion in passport versus what you had to do in history info or in the original diversion header. Next slide. Okay, so what's new? People are kicking the tires on this, and necessarily once that starts happening, once we're doing this in the ATIS testbed and places like that, we start hearing issues. This one was a favorite of mine, is the redirection versus retargeting. So we designed this, again, to handle these retargeting cases. It's important to remember what our threat model is here in STIR. We're trying to prevent certain classes of impersonation attacks. We're not really out to try to track service logic the way that history info and diversion do, where you're hoping that on the terminating side, the entity that is consuming those headers may make some decision about treatment and so on. It's independent of determining whether or not the originator spoofed the call, right? So it just has a different threat model than some of those other mechanisms do. And there's a sense in which, retargeting actually does cause a practical problem. You've thrown an invite over the wall, somebody changes it midstream, there's a passport attached to the invite, and then the changed invite and the passport arrive at a destination, and if the two seem to be out of parity, right, then the verification service can have a real problem figuring out whether or not they should trust this passport. For 302, this shouldn't ordinarily be a problem. Because of course, when there's a redirection, when a 3XX message comes back, you expect usually it will reach the UAC. The UAC will issue a new invite, and at that time could issue a new passport. Now, if you go deep into the bowels of 3261 in the UAC behavior section, right now, I think what it says is that you should, when you receive the 302, keep the original 2, but it's not a must. In some cases, it makes more sense actually for the UAC to change the 2 to reflect the contact headers that were sent back in the 3XX in the backwards direction. And for passport, that's actually preferable, right? In the sense of you want the 2 header field to correspond to the destination that you're going to put into the passport. And so if you're changing what's going in the passport, you should change that. Whether it's the request URI alone or both the request URI and the 2 that you change, in general, there should be no problem with this. Nonetheless, we've had a request for in cases where after a 302, a diversion header would be added to have some way to have a passport reflect that this was securely diverted. And again, I don't think this actually is like salient to our threat model. Like it's not, there's no impersonation attack that is prevented by this. It's just a way of securing that service logic. And like, I'm kind of like, okay, I can see how we can adapt this to this case and, have this, have this passport reflect the diversion for the 302 case, even if it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So what I did in this revision is we put in a provision now that in a 3XX response, it is possible to send a passport back to the UAC that is a diversion passport that could actually then be used in any subsequent invite that is going to be created by the user agent after receiving the 3XX, thereby preserving that diversion in a way very similar to what would happen if the redirect service had instead retargeted. Mm-hmm.
Chris, I think to be clear, we probably want both scenarios, right? One where we do want to reflect the diversion and one that we don't care about the...
Correct, it will not be... So
and it's the new invite that we only care about after.
We only care about, so from an impersonation perspective, we only care about what is in the new invite that's sent. But if you want to capture that service logic, this is all optional. And like, okay, if you're a redirect server, you may send back a passport to the UAC, and the UAC may use it if it's like adding a diversion header and it wants to be clear about, or a history info, and it wants to be super clear about that it was securely retargeted from that destination. Yes,
right. Mary Barnes. So, I mean, yeah, I think we want a broad range of functionality to support various use cases. And I started working on a call flow document. I didn't get it all updated in time because it's incredibly tedious. Yeah. But I think what I'm trying to do is do scenarios and show how we can leverage STIR, right? For some of the voicemail hacking scenarios, I think it'll be very helpful. So
voicemail hacking is an example. I mean, this came up largely actually from global title translation, unsurprisingly, from people that are doing 800 dips, right? With a SIP where this gets, a 3XX response in backwards direction. And then, okay, we're going to reflect now the geographic number instead of the free phone number. But we want to preserve the original free phone number in the diversion header. And is there a way we can securely, show that that was the original call number? So that's what we have. Now, what this does change, because we've said in the past, you can't have like an identity header in responses. So what div now says is, fine, in a 3XX, you can have a passport in an identity header. And that is merely there as an optional mechanism that the UAC could snatch that from and stick it into a new identity and push it back. That's what we have. We could have done it in a body with the 302 instead. If people want to talk about whether there are implementation choices about that people care about, this would be a good time to dig into those. The simplest thing to me seemed to be just allow identity in the backwards direction in that 3XX. And what it means is use this in future invites if you feel like it. That cool with everyone? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody who thinks that that causes any huge problems. Krister pointed out some of the complexities of exactly how many of these you might end up needing, and that can get complicated. So next slide. Okay, so last time we were here, we went through this whole thing of whether we wanted to have like multiple invite or multiple identity headers in a single SIP request, or if we wanted to try to do nesting in cases for divert. And we walked out of here with a consensus, I thought, for nesting. And then a couple weeks later, I started hearing people saying, you know, those like nested passports could get kind of big, right? Like really big, actually, especially if multiple levels of nesting were possible. And some of our vendors like are concerned about the size of these identity headers potentially as a result of that. Next slide. Based on that, I decided to hedge in this version of the divert spec. What I say now is the current guidance is you should do nesting for in-band. You may not. And it's exactly for these complex cases that Krister was raising where, you know, you've got multiple authentication services that are adding identity headers in the first place. Then you end up with like multiple, you know, retargetings from that you want this like n squared problem to arise from this. And so it seems reasonable still to have multiple identity headers for some of these cases. And for now, we're just saying the guidance is to do should. I fear there may be cases like encrypted full-form passports that will come about eventually because people are going to end up carrying sensitive information in these passports down the road potentially. And as a consequence of that, that will require nesting for other reasons. But that's what I've done now. Now we still allow both nested and unnested as options. We have a should for nested, but it's not a must. Are there people here who are concerned? Can I get a sense of who here thinks there is a problem with like the identity header size issue? People looking at me nodding. Yes, Martin seems to think so. Cullen seems to think so. Okay. I mean, I believe it. I believe you that there are implementations where this could be a problem realistically. This is, I think, the best thing for us to do for now. It's easier to correlate the passports if we nest them this way. But, you know, I'm not going to mandate it. Sounds like people are cool with that. Nobody is jumping up to say, John, that's wrong. That's what's in div now. Yes, Adam.
So, Adam Roach, as an individual, I apologize for the hot take, but my initial reaction to this is that having more than one way to do things in a protocol is the best way to guarantee non-interoperable implementations. So if we're going to say that nesting is a problem, then I'd say pull it out altogether. I don't like that solution. I think nesting is far, far more elegant. And I know it'd be really hard to quantify. I'd like to get some like hard data on what size header field to actually cause real implementations in the field problems.
So let's wind back the stack a bit on this too. The reason we really wanted nesting was for out of band, right? Is where this started. Because for out of band, you actually need nesting. Because these things are encrypted, there are blobs that are being stored, and like unless what we're gonna do is, so effectively what we'd have to do is give keys that would let you be able to decrypt the previous ones effectively, right? Or something similar to it in order to actually, or some kind of pointer like that is the only way that would work with out of band. So we started from there, but then we're like, well, if we need this for out of band and we think we can use it for in band, why not do it one way? That's where we ended up last time. Now I've just heard people pushing back saying, I don't know. We could say, and this was on the table last time, nested for out of band and non-nested for in band. That's a perfectly sane option.
And we're not going to run into size issues there either?
With out of band or in?
With out of band, when we start nesting them?
No, out of band is again, you're just storing tokens to CPS that you're getting through RESTful interface. It's not like,
Okay. Well, as inelegant as that is, I think it probably is going to be the best interoperability story.
Yeah,
So.
it's certainly, yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll say there, when I do out of band, I'm not going to go through this in too much depth today, but there are these like gatewaying cases where you might want at a gateway to pull out of in-band to out of band and things like that. So they have to be interworkable too, or at least that's a key use case for it. And this is how we ended up in this path, right?
Right.
So like yeah, there's a line behind you. I don't want
Thank
to
you.
be, yeah.
Chris, I think it's important to point out that from a size perspective, I think either way, the total invite size will be very similar. It's just that the individual header is long. So I think I'd love to hear from people that are concerned more about the individual header being extremely long versus the total size of the invite.
Okay, we almost set this up. Martin Dolly. Okay, so for us, the total size of the invite is less of a problem because we've had to learn how to fragment and take care of that a long time ago. This isn't going over the air, so it's not an issue. Our problem, which we are correcting, was the size of a single header. And there was one network element that we had to do development on in order to correct that. So just to be clear, what I raised my hand for before,
Yeah.
and also answer Chris's question.
But I mean, is the sense that your vendors are going to bump these up to a reasonable limit that would handle nested in the long term? Because if so, let's just do nested, right? I mean,
Colin James, I'm pretty sure I've written code that said max header length 10K.
Yeah.
But I mean, if a bug was reported of that, it's a 10 character fix and a recompile. Like I just, when I really thought about the whole issue with this, I'd much rather see us do the same thing in both inbound and outbound. It's going to be so confusing if we don't. So let's do the same thing and do one thing. And, if somebody needs to fix a bug logged against a product that consists of basically no work, I think that that's really the least of the problems in this overall thing, that's the path of the least pain.
But there's carriers in this room I know that are trying to field this like this year. Can you beat your vendors up into shape to get this done this year?
I'm sure we get beaten.
I'm looking, I see some carriers nodding. Do I see? Okay. Yes.
Channeling for Willie on Jabber. Why can OOB not store multiple headers in a JWT?
Why can't OOB not store multiple headers in a JWT? So certainly there are multiple, you mean multiple claims or?
That's what I'll need that clarification. Yeah. Because I mean, by itself, it is a single header.
So the problem with OOB and storing passports separately is that OOB has to encrypt the passports, right? And so the problem is it's encrypted, each one is encrypted basically to the destination. So only the last hop destination can decrypt the passport for it. And so what this does is it creates, so there are ways we could do OOB where the retargeting entity is responsible for putting in, re-encrypting basically the original passport and putting it in keyed to the new destination. But this is how we end up with nesting in the first place. So like then there's be two blobs, both, that you would end up downloading and decrypting for, for the same endpoint. Why not just actually bind those so which is supposed to go with which? Because there can be quite an assortment, right? They're going to be stored as resources, as a collection, effectively for a particular destination. And that's how we ended up with nesting, right? Was just as a simple way of correlating those things. So, Krister, June.
Yes, Krister, I don't have a problem with nesting as long as we sort out these things. For example, if you have multiple incoming separate identity headers, because I assume you're going to nest all of them into this diversion header, or are you just going to take the previous one? You could I assume diversion can also happen multiple times so you could have one incoming which also contains nesting. So as long as we sort that out, I don't think we should assume that, okay, this use case, you have one incoming identity header, so we nest it and we're done. We have to consider the cases where there are multiple and where you are going to have multiple diversions in the path. So.
My intuition about that, as I think we already discussed in the list, was that for each such independent AS that has provided a passport, there would be a single nested diversion for each time it gets diverted. Right. So in other words, you may go through, as you go through the network, you may accumulate more and more of these diversions at different phases, but like however many identity headers there are will reflect how many different authentication services, decided to chip into this as you go.
Chris, but what you need to describe, it's because you put this, what's the name of this, opt or whatever you
Yeah.
and I think you're only allowed to have one of those within JSON. So if you have, I think there's a rule saying that.
The point is, though, multiple diversions will result in multiple layers of nesting, right?
Sure.
So there will be
but
another op that's embedded inside the JWT that is embedded.
yeah, but
inside
in the simple case where you do the first diversion,
yeah,
and you have, let's say that you have two incoming identities,
yeah.
you are going to nest both of those. So you need to describe, how do you nest both of these?
Well, like I said, so you take the first identity header and you nest it, and then you take the second identity header and you nest it, and there are two headers that are each going to have one nesting in them.
Sure.
And when you reach the second service, you're going to re-nest for each of those two. And if a third identity header got added along the way, you just have one layer of nesting in that one.
That's fine, but I don't think the draft describes that now, so that it needs to
I
be.
think this is work. So it's just think about, like, we want each authentication service that is separately adding a passport to the request to add its own identity header, basically in inbound. And yes, we can clarify this if this is what you want clarified. How are we doing for time?
Okay.
How many more minutes do we have? Of my 20?
Play the game.
Yeah, sorry.
Figure it out.
Okay, next slide anyway, and I'll keep talking when I figure that out. There's been some mailing list traffic in general about ordering of these things. I have been, I'll admit, a bit confused about some of this. I'm not sure there's really a problem ordering identity header fields at all, because of what I just said, right? I mean, to me, like, if one identity header is being added by each authentication service and then nesting is what occurs, it doesn't matter what order those are in. And frankly, I don't trust intermediaries to preserve the order anyway. These aren't via headers, right? Like, I would not be surprised if these things were munged and spit out in completely different orders when they go through SPCs. So I would rather design a mechanism that does not rely on expecting that those header fields are actually ordered in the request. Is there something I'm missing in this, where there's like actually some attack or that can result from this?
Chris, no, I think it was more from a SIP perspective, because as far as I know, the RFC 3261 and also other extension RFCs defining new headers where you can have multiple instances. For each header, there's always a description how you add new ones. Do you put them from top to bottom, or do you put them from bottom to up? So it was more a protocol thing. So I think we described that for each other header where you can have multiple instances. My question was, why don't we do that for identity too? Okay. And I agree with you. Currently, we don't have any use cases where it really matters. But I'm just thinking in future, if there could come some. Because this is not a difficult thing to do. We just need to specify it. So obviously, if it would be an update to the RFC 822, because it's not really passport specific. But
yeah, it would be the 8224. I agree, but yeah. I just don't understand what we're getting out of doing that.
Well, if no one else, I just think it would be a clean thing to do from a SIP protocol perspective.
And so, certainly, I'm more sympathetic to your concerns about ordering of the claims of passport, and that it seems unnecessary, because ultimately there is a canonicalization and serialization algorithm for it that we're going to execute, before we actually pass this through. But I think it does no harm to have to specify the order there. So it's the flip side of the same argument. Sure, we could fix that to make it so that it's not required to say what the order is for these things, but since there is a deterministic algorithm that determines how you serialize it, but at the same time, I don't see any value in fixing it, given that we specified it that way at the start, and there's not much we're going to gain from doing an update to E225 to fix that.
6 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've covered pretty much all this anyway. Next slide. Sorry.
Chris, because we were talking the same slide both about the identity headers and the order of identity headers and the order of claims. Are you saying that we're not gonna care about any of those, or we are going to write the order of
so
claims
I personally don't
within
see,
JSON?
there's other things I'd rather fix that we broke than that. Like so.
No, because this all came out from from you have in our because of the must which you have in A225, which is that
yeah.
you must describe, and this becomes a problem when you use the confac. As long as you have everything in the JSON, it doesn't cause a problem but when, for example, if you're going to use the RPH, for example, and you already have the you have the resource priority zip header field, so you may choose not to put it into the JSON. So you need to know the order, or certain entities are going to calculate different.
But there's a way that you deterministically serialize JSON, and because. Right, you basically you take that and you alphabetize the SAT in the way that they define. So it's never going to be ambiguous how the signature comes out from that, right? I mean, no matter how you build the claims object in its JSON representation, and correct me if I'm wrong, the serialization will result in those being sorted properly. And
sure, because with the draft says
sort.
that they're putting in this this alphabet.
That's my point. So it's not actually broken in the sense that people. I understand why you say that the language is useless. I think I agree that it is useless, the language that is in there. But however, its uselessness is not enough reason for me to change this because it's not actually broken. Like it's not like this won't work because of that. It's just useless.
Chris went, yeah, I think if you're implementing 8225, then it's always deterministic.
Yes.
That's exactly what the text says. So I don't mind putting order in, like you said, as just a helpful hint. But
it could be a helpful
if
hint.
you're implementing, your implementation of 8225 should be putting everything in lexicographical order and just.
Okay. Another suggestion from Krista, actually, I believe again, that we separate out opt from div. I'm open to that. If we think there are other extensions that might want to have embedded passports within them other than div, and we want to be able to point to those, I can do that. But does anybody else care? It's the kind of thing where I'm not sure what that extension would be that would necessitate that. Does anybody feel strongly about this either way, about whether opt should be kind of under div, and maybe we would define it differently if we needed another way to bind these things together? This is one of these things where it's such a minor matter of the syntax that I don't care. No one else cares either.
Wow. Right. That surprises me.
I guess on balance, probably I would separate it out. I think it's easy to do. So in other words, opt would not be under div, but would be a separate claim, and that would just appear concurrently with div. And then so just in case some future extension also wants to use opt, they can say we're using opt as specified in RFC, blah, 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 blah. I'll do that. So are we okay with that? Okay. Next. This is the point that I raised earlier. So we didn't get this right in 8224. This is the kind of thing one updates in 8224 for, by the way, is that we kind of just have in the BNF that it's token is what the value is for PPT equals. Yet everything I've written about this has always had quotes around those values. And there is actually a little stray piece of text that talks about how it is a quoted string that appears in the PPT parameter in 8224. It's just not in the BNF, and it's not done in any useful place in the document, which is exactly why the RPH document has it unquoted, because we were not clear about this in 8224. Now, there's not much use in quoting it, to be honest. It's not like we gain a lot of value. That's 2 wasted bytes pretty much. So we could also just back that out in 8224 and say we'd rather do it unquoted. Again, this is one of these things, the two choices are so similar, I hesitate to even pose it as a question, but does anybody feel strongly about how we should try to repair this clerical oversight on our part? Yeah, so my intuition is that, so I had it all quoted, and the 8224 does say it's quoted. We could just put something into one of these passport documents that says, oh, by the way, clarifying what was in 8224, we did mean quoted, because it does say quoted in there. We need to change it in 8224 to that one stray piece of text that talks about it being quoted.
Chris went, did you check info and now? Do we specify that, but not PPT, or is it equally ambivalent?
I mean, I could look right now. I don't know off the top of my head.
I mean, just purely from
Yeah.
consistency's sake, we've been quoting those things.
We have been quoting those things.
But
Yeah.
I don't feel strongly about it.
I would say let's quote them, probably, if nobody cares either way. Does anybody care? I mean, there's a whole separate question of whether or not it should actually be mandatory too, which has come up, and I like it as mandatory to have PPT in the SIP header, so you can just look at the header and immediately say, oh, I know whether or not I understand this passport type without having to crack the JWT open. In addition, of course, for compact form, obviously you won't have a JWT to crack open. So I kind of like it as mandatory. It's been raised. Why do we do that? Because if you're using full form, should you just be able to omit? And I see the argument, but I think there's some value in having it be explicit in the SIP header, whether or not what's inside that passport is going to be something you support or not. Anyway, this is something down the road we might want to clarify if we find we're running into more implementation timelines around this. Next slide. Oh, Mary.
I mean, I think it's better to Mary Barnes, let's go ahead and make it mandatory, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, it is mandatory now.
Okay, and that's fine. Leave it that
Yeah.
way then. Yeah.
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 A question was raised, should it be mandatory? Since, I mean, if you're using full form, you can just like look in the.
Well, yeah,
passport
I
and
understand,
see
but I
that
think it's
PPT is on.
easier.
Agreed.
It's better across the board.
That's
if
how I like it.
Okay.
Same reason we have info be mandatory, right? So I do appreciate Krister taking a closer read of this. We need some more closer reads. I think this is getting close to done. I'll patch in the stuff that we're discussed here today, but I think we're getting pretty close on this.
Okay, what I'm hearing is working group last call after one more update. Is that right? Okay.
And I'll do just a 1-minute blurb about Edabone, pretty much.
You're really close.
Next slide. I'm not even going to talk about what out of band is for. Next slide. This is the picture. We got the CPS, we got the AS and the VS. They're putting passports up in this service, probably a web service, because they cannot tunnel signaling in band. And ASs and VSs here could be end user devices, could be PBXs, could be gateways, could be whatever. This is the generic model for STIR out of band. Next slide. So what's new? All I really did this time, so we added some text about AS and VS behavior. If you read 8224, actually, that's the place where we do AS and VS behavior. It is like really, really SIP specific. And so I've written a version of that that rips all of that out. So it is now very generic to how you would just evaluate a passport against, you know, a CDR, right? Which is basically what we have to go on in the out-of-band case. And, you know, some of the steps are specific to how you interface with the CPS, like, you know, acquiring the necessary keys and those kinds of things. But there's now some behavior for that I think gives us a much better sense of what an AS and VS would be like for out-of-band. And I mocked up a little REST interface for it. If Ecker were here, I'm sure he'd be pummeling me for all the problems that I introduced in that. But the point was just to give a sense of like what a REST interface might look like to a CPS. It's a pretty obvious approach. It does not integrate any of Ecker's fancy flood control mechanisms using that unblinded hash stuff at the moment that I don't understand that he needs to do himself. But we will at least have a description of how to do that probably in the next version of the draft. Next. So we need to flesh out the solution more, need to do more than just have that be a mock-up. We need to specify at least one CPS discovery mechanism. I think what I'm leaning towards for this, to be honest, these days, and I hope, Martin, you've taken your blood pressure medication today. Okay. What I've been leaning towards in this is actually, you know, using the credentials themselves to point to the CPS. In other words, having the certs and the cert discovery process be what points you to the CPS. There'll just be like a field in the cert that's like, oh, here's where the CPS is for this particular number or resource or whatever. And you'll find those through a blockchain. I think that will be our service discovery mechanism. You're still with us, Martin. Martin, we need to call the paramedics. Okay. So seriously, we'll do something. This is a much studied problem, service discovery. I think it's really the last outstanding problem we don't understand well for this. I think that is the way that is probably closest to the spirit of how out-of-band is supposed to work, however. And so we may mock that up and just, you know, kick the tires on it, see if it works. Might actually get us somewhere. that's it. I don't think we really need to discuss much on this today. And I will give the rest of my time
Okay.
to other people. So more to come, no action needed.
Okay, Eric Berger, you're up next. I see Eric's in the room, but he hasn't pushed the button yet. Yeah. Come on, Eric. Eric, you need to get, there you go.
Hi there.
Hello, we hear you.
Very good, very good. And I'm hearing me, hearing you, hearing me. Did you get my PowerPoint version or you got the?
Yeah, we're all set.
Excellent.
He's
Okay.
putting them up.
Oh, so like I put up mine since you're looking at my rocks, it looks like, or those your rocks? Those are your rocks.
No, those are,
Brian's rocks.
it's the registry.
And there. So
There we go.
slideshow.
There you go.
Sorry, go.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. And actually, I will actually just go back to the first one just for a moment, because one question I get is IANA up for this? And the answer is yes, IANA is up for this. And I also wanted to thank Krister because he did ask a question on the list. All right, now we can go to the next one. And this will be the only time I'll do the problem statement because people should have read the draft. Basically, as we know, STIR certificate authorities are not the same as web certificate authorities. It's an absolute statement. I know in a lot of countries there are going to be different companies doing that. It's also a structural statement as the roots of trust problem is different. I'm not going to read the rest of this to you, but if you're thinking, why do we need different STIR roots? You probably haven't been participating in STIR for the past 5 years. The last one, though, we are talking about national resources, E164 numbers, and countries tend to have proprietary interests in things that basically, to date, belong to countries. I'll take the next slide. One part of how they're different is who can be the CA for a given country's telephone number appears to be mandated by the country. If you just hit the build there, you'll see Canada is insisting it be a Canadian company. The United States is expecting it to be a US company. You can imagine similar things going on for, like, say, the European Union, Russia, China, and so on. So if you can go to the next, and there you see the text area. Let's go to the next one. So this is addressing sort of a practical issue. It's pretty easy. If you're Rogers in Canada, CRTC is going to tell you who the STIR certificate authority is. In the US, the FCC, there's a process going on now, and we can tell Martin, who the root of trust is. But what happens when we get a call in the UK that's originated in Canada? How does that, operator BT know who's supposed to be the official certificate authority, the root of trust for that? So we take the next one. An answer, and this is just, the proposal, is that we create a STIR root certificate registry, which basically maps countries to root certificates, so the public keys, the root certificates. It would be managed by IANA in the document, it talks about the expert review for that. And basically, the data elements here is the ISO 3166-1 two-letter country code, .uk, .us, .ca, .cn. And in the registry is the P7B format for the public key of the root certificate authority or authorities that, yes, out of the box, the assumption is I can think of at least one country that is likely to have multiple root certificate authorities for a country or a region. You might say, if we go to the next slide, but this is Stern, we're dealing with telephone numbers. So we have another registry that maps the numeric country code. That's +44 for the UK, +32 for Belgium. Where things get a little weird are overlapping numeric codes. The North American numbering plan +1 has a whole bunch of countries under +1. +7, Russia and Kazakhstan share the +7 space. 881, 882, and 883 are special international services and satellite services, which again have multiple countries below them. And so the model here is a longest match, which also, by the way, can deal with regional authorities. For example, if there is, it turns out, a single provider for +1, that handles very nicely. You could imagine a single certificate authority for all of +3 and +4, except for the countries that want their own below that. Also, it handles opting out. So, for example, you could say the US and Canada might have their own country-specific designated root certificate authorities, but Montserrat's not doing STIR at all. And so we've got a way to basically flag that so that when Martin gets a call from Montserrat, he doesn't reject it out of hand because it's not signed. We go to the next slide, a little more detail on the registry policy. This is the identical process is used for the time zone database. Basically, we have expert review. It happens that ITUD, and no, that's not a typo, it is ITUD that publishes a directory of national numbering authorities. So like it basically says, it's the FCC for the US, it's Ofcom for the UK, CRTC for Canada. And they are likely to just publish who their root certificates are. The expert can obviously call them. And if you can't figure it out, or if there's a dispute, to take it to the list, which is again the same model we have for the time zone database. With that, there actually are, and I found two open issues. One is in the draft, another one that kind of came into my mind as I was writing up the slides. So if we go to the next slide. One is, right now in the draft, I'm expecting that there are going to be as many disputes on this as the time zone database, which to date has been none. So rather than set up a new list, I said, hey, take it to the RAI list. But an open issue there, if we did want to do this model is, do we want a dedicated list for disputes here? The other is whether or not these two registries actually have lives of their own. Because it kind of dawned on me having a E164 Annex D, so that's the national number codes +1, +33, +32, to the actual countries underneath that, whether that would be generally useful beyond STIR. Although, of course, this just establishes the registry, so we could keep it in one document. So those were the open issues that I've seen from the limited discussion on the list and people coming up to me otherwise. Any other open issues?
The mic line is forming, Eric.
Thanks. Yeah, I can see.
No, this is Krister, and I gave the comment, if you go by one slide back, regarding the expert review. I think the drafts need, the current version does say anything about what's expected from our expert review. Normally in the SIP world, for example, the expert review checks, does this. It's quite easy for the expert reviewer to actually go and check RFCs and so on. But is you mentioned, for example, that the expert reviewer may actually call this country and so on, or it may check this ITUD database and all this kind of thing. I think that needs to be spelled out, because this requires a little more from the expert reviewer when what we require, for example, when someone registers an SDP attribute or something.
Right.
Chris, I was going to ask a similar question. Not being familiar with the time zone thing or other things, is there an explicit authority check or whatever? And if you maybe could take 15 seconds to explain that.
Yeah, well, part of it is the different countries are likely to do really different stuff. You've seen, in fact, if you look at the US one, it's highly unlikely that the FCC is going to, tell you what it is. It's more likely the FCC is going to say, hey, we're going to have some organization that figures out who can be root certificate authority issuers, and then a different probably set of organizations that will actually be the root certificate authorities for the US. Whereas Canada is pretty much saying, hey, we're planning on doing this company. What do you think? And then obviously others are not going to do anything. And that's why it is a little loosey-goosey, but obviously you can tighten that up a little bit. Just say, here are where I say where the resources are, but to actually say, all right, I told you where the resources are. You might want to look at them.
Jonathan Rosenberg. Like others have commented, I think expert review is sort of an understatement. In a lot of ways, this is like running a CA, and this IANA expert is going to be responsible for issuing the equivalent of EV certs, but not nearly as low touch and easy as that, because this is basically is this really the owner of this country? Is this a person who can issue certificates for the phone numbers in an entire country? This isn't going to be like the time zone database. If this is someone who just pressed the OK button, this is going to be 3 minutes till it's attacked by, spammers or issuing or someone bad guy trying to convince the expert reviewer to approve them basically as a CA. This is like the root CA for the root CAs. I can't think of something that's more dangerous. And to put it in the hands of it'll just be expert review. This seems like I don't know how to solve the problem, by the way, but I don't think IANA expert review is anywhere near the level of sufficiency for the type of security properties needed in this system.
Well, there is an easy answer, which is the ITUT does this, and we just give them the registry. It's what they do.
Sean Peterson here to advocate for the ITU doing this. No, so I am going to advocate for us not doing it, though, for any number of reasons. One of which is, so I think we're conflating what STIR is in some respects with what Shaken is in this entire discussion. I understand what the GA is and the PA is, but those are not concepts that are IETF concepts. STIR is a technology that is applicable to things beyond what a national authority wants to do. And I think the scope of this, again, I completely understand the problem that you're articulating. I'm sure that people in study group 2 understand that the problem you're articulating very well as well, and I'll be very, very interested in this proposal and in creating a series of liaisons that look, they're just as complex and ultimately just as self-defeating as the ones we generated for public enum, which led us down a long rat hole of IB and Geneva meetings that ultimately resulted in us doing private enum instead. Right. We created something so unwieldy, it was impossible for us to find a middle ground between us where anything tractable could happen. So it's not that I don't understand the problem. Like Jonathan, I'm just kind of in the boat of, I don't know the right way to do this. I do know, I can't imagine the liability that we would be incurring from this if we put this on IANA's shoulders in addition to everything else that we do here. And I just don't think this isn't our expertise. We aren't responsible for the concepts that are built in behind this. And I don't want to import all that stuff into the work we do here. The IETF generally is not in the business of telling people who to trust and why. And I really would not like us to be in that business.
John?
Yes, sir.
I'm not, well, in a sense, we are asking the IETF for the expert review on the one hand. On the other hand, this is what ICANN does every day.
I can, yeah. So again, I certainly would not conflate ICANN and the IANA either. They have a relationship, and I do not conflate those people. If you want to try to bring this to ICANN, I think that's a saner argument, frankly. It's closer to what Jonathan was just describing when he was talking about the root of the root CAs, right? There's a sense in which the root of authority for naming for the Web PKI does reside with ICANN because the control of the TTLDs and the CCTLDs and so on resides there, well, to a certain extent. So, I mean, yeah, I just don't see this. This doesn't feel to me like the place where our views of this are going to be the ones that are going to carry the day. So just to understand, the issue is not the registry. The issue is whether the IETF is involved. Wow. I mean, when you put it that way, that's even scarier. So, I mean, what would it mean for the IETF not to be involved in the creation of a registry like this in the IANA?
Right.
So yeah, if you think that ICANN should be able to create their own IANA registries that do things like this, that would be its own whole thing. Like I said, you were there for the CNUM stuff, man. You remember what this was like. You remember the IV like hassles we went through with this, and I mean it was a gong show, and it ultimately led to us exploding all of that work and replacing it with let's just let people trust the databases that they have rather than trying to build some global monolithic hierarchical system, right? And it's because we're not good at telling people who they should trust and why. Sorry, there's a long line.
So we have a long line. We need to move along quickly.
Jim Reed. Some of the comments that have been made before by John and Jonathan are very well made. And I was also involved in the ENUM stuff all those 20 odd years ago. And I think in this case, the expert review thing is going to be a really big problem. And I think it will put huge degrees of responsibility on the IANA or whoever is going to be operating this registry of sorts. One of the difficulties that we had with the ENUM, especially on the ITU side, was actually getting a definitive statement out of an administration about who speaks for the numbering plan in that country. And you cannot rely purely on the public information that's published by ITUD or anybody else in that organization in Geneva. And back in the days of the ENUM, we actually had a case of one country where the official ITU contact did not want to have anything to do with ENUM for that country, but the people who went to study group 2 meetings did want to get the national delegation. And the problem then is if you then talk to an expert review, you cannot be guaranteed you're talking to someone that can really speak definitively about what's being done. And I think, unfortunately, this is probably going to, if you go down this path much further, I think we're going to end up repeating all the same stuff that we did with ENUM before, and liaison statements, and having ITU come up with some interim procedures to figure out who will then speak for a given country or a given resource about those numbering resources, and then give the allocation to say who's going to be the root CA for that chunk of the number space. I think this is going to be very hard. And if I was in IANA's shoes, I would want to run away from this as far as possible and have nothing to do with it. At least if the ITU takes care of it, they've got diplomatic immunity. No one's going to sue them about it.
That's Richard Barnes. I'd like to ask for a show of hands in the room of relying parties who would like to outsource the development of their root lists to IANA or ICANN or the ITU or anyone else. Okay, seeing no hands. The premise of this document is that the relying parties in the system are not going to invest the effort to develop their own trust list, their own lists of root authorities that they're going to trust. They're going to outsource this to some registry and just blindly trust whatever the expert for this registry says is the right thing. That's a pretty big assumption in my mind. Like our experience in every other PKI we've seen is that people take this decision, relying parties take this decision about who to trust very seriously, and they're going to want to do their own validation and their own vetting. And so there's some question as to whether this is valuable at all. It seems like to the degree that it does add value, it will be as a starting point for people to do their own investigations, for the AT&T legal department to go figure out who's the right authority for Malaysia and to, if they're going to accept and validate things from there. And so if that's, and since that's the case, it seems like the decision-making part of this is almost not valuable at all. You might as well have a first come, first serve registry where you can drop something in and say, you know, I am a provider for Malaysia, and there might be 5 or 6 in there, but it's up to the relying parties to sort that out because they need to do that vetting anyway. They shouldn't just be blindly relying on what's in the list.
Okay, I'm closing the mic line. Please keep it short.
Hi, Pat Tarpey, Ofcom. From a regulatory perspective, this raises some interesting challenges, and I think that we would have some reservations about handing off the assertion of the root CA to a third party. It's worth bearing in mind, Eric, that in the United Kingdom, the regulated services, failure of said services at a larger scale can impose fines for operators. So there's an issue there about whether if I was an operator, I'd be satisfied to in effect give to a third party where there is some liability. We note that there is a necessity to have some form of root CA and how that will be organised. I would suggest the door at Ofcom is always open to yourselves here at the IETF. We're willing and eager to speak to you, and I would also urge you to speak to organisations such as BEREC as well, and obviously the ITU. Thanks.
Thanks.
Channeling for Willie. Any country regulator will accept multiple CAs. The signer will use its CA validators, will find it in the policy administrators database managed by the national authorities. This would make a trusted reference plane for TNCAs. As Eric mentioned, this resource CAs then could be openly used. Isn't such an approach open enough?
Go ahead. Okay. Jonathan Rosenberg, to follow up to what Richard said, I do think there's a problem here in that how do you know which CAs to trust? And even if you don't want to use an IRN registry, it's a pretty good question. And I think it is different from the traditional web world where you can look at a standard set of practices and policies and things they follow. But in here, we're adding another dimension, which is, how does this CA effectively have its authoritative knowledge about who in fact owns these phone numbers? And I think that's a pretty hard question, especially if we think the remit of this problem is to solve this in an international, global, worldwide setting. It's not obvious to me at all as an entity building, say, IPPBXs or something. Whose CA should I put in to trust Zimbabwe numbers? I have no idea.
Okay, Eric, any last comments before we move on?
Well, no, as Jonathan said, it is a problem needs solving, not just, if we're going to do science projects, this seems to be a worthwhile science project to figure out. Not married to the solution, but the problem does need some addressing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
John, you're up for the 4916. If you could do less than 10, it'd be good.
Is this connected?
Connected, yes. Yeah, connected.
Sorry.
Yes, I forgot about this one. I'm back again. Hello. Next slide. We're going to try to do this one quick since I know I wasted too much of our time earlier. Connected identity. Back in the day when we did good old 4474, it only worked for requests. We put the identity header in requests alone. There was at least one really practical reason for this, which is you can't send a 403 in response to a 200. There were a lot of people who said at the start of the identity kind of discussions there, well, why couldn't you just start putting signatures on responses as well as requests? Part of the answer is the actual semantics of SIP don't map to something where you can meaningfully kind of reject a response that you've gotten. So John Elway became really fixated on this, and I was never entirely sure why. He pursued this doggedly for years. He really wanted there to be a way to get connected identity stuff to work. So he wrote this document, 4916. And, you know, we didn't really learn from the lessons of that in that by the time we did 8224, we still pretty much just did it for requests. However, you know, that was really based on the fact that we're trying to beat a specific threat model in here. We're trying to prevent illegal robocalling, impersonation that enables that, voicemail hacking, swatting, phishing, all this bad stuff. And those all result from requests, largely from invite requests. And we don't need to do responses in order to beat that. But what this new document that Chris and I hacked together for this time talks about, it's a problem we've become a bit preoccupied by lately. Is there actually a callee impersonation problem? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is that there is. There are a variety of spectacular hijacking attacks that have been demonstrated in the wild. Yeah, those of you who are familiar with this are aware. Some of them are based on exploits of like the mobile roaming systems. Some of them, again, just are based on the fact that a lot of IP routing, frankly, uses routing tables that are pretty arbitrary. Like we were just talking about, since we never quite got public enum right, there are a lot of just private enum resolution databases that have whatever data in them they want to figure out how to route numbers. And so I think there is, unfortunately, kind of a callee impersonation problem. And there's a need that has been identified to be able to secure more trust between endpoints that are reached by a call, and especially consumers that are calling a certain categories of institutions. And I think that we can leverage the STIR work and the stuff that John Elway did, for the most part, largely unchanged, to try to address this problem space. Next slide. The basic idea is just to do STIR backwards. If we imagine a case where there's a client that's calling a financial institution, they're calling Fidelity Investments, we'll say, you know, everything normally happens. The same logical authority signs the request on the way to it. But then the financial institution they've reached has an opportunity using the 4916 mechanisms to send requests in the backwards direction in the dialogue that actually validate who it was you connected to, and to make sure that the client can actually verify I reached the right person. Next slide. And there are a couple of big questions about this. The draft does not try to dig into mechanisms or solution. It really is kind of a problem statement. But there are some different moving pieces in this. For example, it's possible to do things before a call even starts that could help kind of tee up what your relationship is potentially, especially, again, financial institutions, health institutions are the ones that people are largely fixated on for this. You could do some key discovery mechanisms. You could do discovery of what security services are available, potentially outside the context of a call starting. I've been thinking that the results of a failure in this would be similar to the results of a failure of, say, negotiating SRTP. In other words, we would kind of not send media unless we get connected identity for this set of, again, you imagine like there'll be some kind of like a requires, again, I don't want to solution here today, but something that will let the user tell its client, I really need to reach this person. And if I'm not reaching this person, you need to shut this call down. And that may only matter for a certain category, right, of potential callees, but it would be something like that we would just kind of cut the media stream or never even start it if we don't get back this strong assertion. And there are user experience questions about how that works. I mean, we're not like looking at a display typically after we hit the call button. So what happens in terms of how a user knows either that things are good or bad is something we're probably not going to dictate, but we want to provide at least hooks for into this. Next slide. And the good news is actually Adam did this exercise in SIP Brandy for us, where you went back in 2016 and went through 4916, do you remember? And kind of tried to see, is this actually, you know, relatively still aligned with us? Obviously, there's a lot of like example text in 4916 that still uses the identity info header, which we have deprecated. So things like that aren't really applicable. But there's only one tiny normative fix that Adam identified from that, which resulted from the way we've hacked the resending mechanism for full form versus compact form in 8224. So nothing too invasive. In other words, I think the actual protocol update to 4916 will be small. But the procedures that we will articulate in order to solve this particular callee impersonation problem is really what'll be interesting in this. And yeah, we'll do the same thing as 4916. We'll send an update in the backwards direction that lets you see who it is you reached, and that'll be signed with the passport, and it'll look just like you'd think. Next slide. So this is like a trial balloon. Chris and I put this draft out. You can read it, read the problem statement. If people are interested in this, do people think there is a problem? I have heard from some of these large institutions that they are concerned about this and would like a solution for something in this space. And anybody here want a +1 or -1 this? I see some thumbs coming up from various people in the room. I see Martin nodding. I see, yes, Chris. Well, you worked on it with me, so I hope you're a +1 man.
Yeah, just to add, I think there's a lot of, security use cases. I think there's a lot of potential, customer value add features we could add to this. As simple as I dialed the wrong number and I get something back that shows a completely different person than I thought I was dialing.
Yep.
So I think it goes all the way up the chain from simple use cases to really interesting ones that we can imagine in the future.
No, I mean, I think vishing use cases with like adjacent numbers or confusing things through in text where I got this number in a text and I click on it and we could actually get in front of you and tell you you're not connecting to the person you think you're connecting to. There's like things like that are possible with enough pre-association. Again, if you assume that we can do some things beforehand for the financial institutions that you're related to identify things like that, it's possible we could beat some interesting attacks. Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan Rosenberg. I think there are some hard problems here on the user experience, and because redirection is not always an attack. To give an example, in an enterprise context, it's very common to have these like hunt groups, and the call bounces around like 5 different people, and it might go to a consultant. You can configure it with, outside lines, whatever. So like, is that bad? Probably not. So yeah. I mean, and again, to your point, like if you do is this, like, well, what do you do about this? I think those are hard problems.
I think so. We do talk a little bit about the transfer once you've made an initial connection, even in things like that, going through hunt groups. And yeah, I think our primary interest here again is that we hope that there will be through things like Chris's TN-POP, for example, and Shaken stuff, there will be ways that we can get certs down to these organizations that will still let them present. I'm like an agent of fidelity. Even if you've gone through a hunt group and ended up, transferring to somebody who's like, a home, telecommuting call center worker and things like that. So I think we can help. I think we can help with this. I'm not going to say that it's an easy problem necessarily, but I think we can provide things that are better than nothing. Yes, Bernie.
Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure whether I understood it correctly, but you're trying to assert these devices as opposed to persons. I'm not sure about the usefulness of financial institution if you can confirm it's your device, but not confirm that's really the user they want to talk to and is using this device.
I don't really think it's a device thing. Again, I think of this like they're administrative entities that'll have these certificates and that the certificates will be pretty broad, right? So I don't think, we're not trying to couple this too strongly to any particular device for the connected identity.
I was just wondering about use case here about financial institutions when a credit card company calls you and wants to identify you. And if she identifies the device, it's not really sure that's really you behind it or the person they want to identify. So
That's the flip side of this, though. We're talking about identifying the person you called. So if I'm calling a U.S. bank, right? How do I know that I reached U.S. bank and that this wasn't redirected or hijacked or sent in to some place it shouldn't go?
Okay.
Which is a slightly different problem again.
Okay.
That's the threat model we hope to address in this. For again, there's a particular set of institutions that have expressed interest in having this capability. It seems adjacent to what we're doing. And again, it's an impersonation problem. It's a callee impersonation problem. And I think we might be able to get some traction on this. I'd like to see if we can make it work.
Okay, thanks.
But in general, everybody thinks this is pretty cool. We should keep working on this, try to get somewhere with it. I see people think this is pretty cool. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Callbacks next.
So could you do Stir first? SipCoin first.
Sorry?
Could we do SipCoin first?
Sure. Okay. SipCoin first. In the box. The box is new since you brought it up.
Since it was last year.
Posted it while we were meeting.
Oh, that's this one. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, but I didn't have time.
So go fetch it. Go fetch it.
All right.
Take a
So
brief
let me
pause
move
while
this.
we-
Yeah. Let's get out of this just for now. All right. Okay. Do that.
Off the agenda.
Very short.
That's fine.
Thursday. No. Materials. Sorry. Where's this one?
Didn't stir.
Yeah. So you want coin first?
Yeah.
Coin.
Coin and callback. Get them both while you're there.
Yeah. Let me get coin. Oh, well. I did the wrong thing. Oops. All right. And back to here. And here. Here. Oh, I see what happened.
You downloaded it.
Yeah, I downloaded it because it's a PPT file. All right, so now we can do a slideshow on this. And there you go.
Yay.
Sorry.
That's all right. Hello, everyone. Jonathan Rosenberg, and I'm here to talk about SIPcoin. So next slide, please. Since there's a lot of questions, why am I here? I thought I'd clarify that I'm doing an initial coin offering for my blockchain startup doing virtual reality quantum computing. No, next slide. Just kidding. So, though there's a lot of hype on this tech, like, I'm interested in this in the callback draft for the same reason a lot of us are here. Like, I worked on the SIP stuff with y'all for a long time, and I'm freaking tired of all these robocalls. And I said, maybe I can help. So I wrote some drafts, and I haven't been involved much in the stir stuff, I know. So here's some ideas to try and make it better. That's it. That's it. There's no ulterior motives. So this one's of the two drafts, this one's sort of more of the moonshot crazy idea. And we have a lunch session after this to talk more about it and other concepts. And I'm not going to go through the technical stuff in the draft, but rather I want to focus on the part you may have skipped because it's the most interesting part of the document, which is sort of the walk you through the layer of argumentation. I'm going to spend most of my time on the third here. So what is the purpose of this draft? Like it makes the following, you have to sort of buy the following arguments in sequence. One, this is fairly orthogonal to verified caller ID. Like even in a world where we have verified caller ID, I assert that will help, but it will not stop the bad guys. And if you don't agree with that, then you sort of, then you don't need this document at all. So we should certainly discuss that. Second, if you feel that doesn't solve it, then I argue also that economic disincentives are one of the more optimal techniques to prevent these type of robocalling attacks. The third argument, which is the thing I'm going to spend time on, is, well, can you actually solve this with economics? And so there is an economic analysis in the document. And I believe, interestingly, the answer is yes, that at least based on real data, it's back of the envelope, admit, but real data says that there is, in fact, an interesting, pretty wide range, actually, of cost targets that disincent attackers while not also being overly burdensome for non-attackers. And the last part, which is interestingly the most contentious part of the document, is also perhaps the least interesting aspect of the document, which is that we can incur a cost target via computational work. And it's hip these days to say blockchain and Bitcoin suck because they burn power. I'm certainly going to go do some math to see whether or not this is actually a consequential amount of power, but there's other ways to solve that problem. The more interesting thing is, do you think that an economic disincentive is interesting? And then you can ask the question whether or not computation is the right way to pay the cost. Next slide. And so again, people hated this. I'll present in a moment some other ideas even beyond this draft. Obviously, this is not a baked proposal. Next slide. So I assert come to the mic if you disagree. Verified caller ID will not be sufficient. And certainly the reason is it's not just the U.S., it's outside of the U.S. I guarantee you there will be some countries somewhere which offer numbers at relatively low cost, and they will be verified. Now, maybe you think that I'll just block all international calls, and I don't know. Some people like getting international calls, so how do you know? So I think there's a risk. I think even if you focus on a single country like the U.S., we've got a lot of carriers. No offense, Martin, it's not just AT&T, Verizon. There are a few others. It's a long tail. Some of them want money. Like some might give out my phone numbers for cheap, and there's a lot of phone numbers. And they're not all valid numbers, obviously. But in the North American number plan, if you just count the number of digits available, it's a pretty big number. I can imagine people doing fake area codes or whatever. It seems like it'll reduce it, but it is not going to completely kill it. And so even if you think you can't do any of those other things, I might rotate numbers. I might rotate numbers in different regions. I will buy some numbers from Verizon and AT&T, and I'll use them until they get blocked, and then I'll buy different numbers. I mean, these are all games that you can imagine playing, and as long as there's an economic incentive, these games will be played. Next slide. I argue, why economic disincentives? So it's a proven technique. I mean, it's certainly used in lots of other industries. I mean, it's the entire foundation of the U.S. tax system and probably other places too, is to incent or disincent good and bad behaviors for things. And without it, there's always an economic incentive to work around, right? And this sort of addresses that. So next slide. So the interesting thing, which I'm just going to spend a couple more minutes on, so I want to talk more about callback, is there a valid cost target? This is the most interesting point of the draft. So I want to walk you through this because this is interesting, right? So I just from some public data, and I'd actually welcome feedback for people who have better data than this, okay? There were 2.5 billion robocalls in April 2017 from an article I found. And it also quoted that same article, $350 million in cost to Americans in years prior. Admittedly, that's there's a temporal gap there. So again, back of the envelope. So, but is it 10 times more revenue in the 6 years since? Probably not. Okay, so close enough. So that's over 36 months. That's $97.5 million in the U.S. profit per month. And it took 2.5 billion calls to get there. And we get 0.38 cents of profit per call. That's the metric we're interested in. Profit per call. Why? I want to destroy that profit per call. So if you want to take a minimum of a 50% profit erosion, that means death. That's 0.19 cents per call. So you need to cause the robocallers at least 0.19 cents per call of payment in order to basically make this not profitable anymore. Next slide. Now everyone asks, well, what about the good guys? Are you going to incur costs of them? So this is, I again did the math on that. It's in the document. So again, back in the envelope, if we take a mobile phone bill, it's $100 on average. Let's say we don't want the user to, let's say AT&T and Verizon pass on the cost to the consumer, 3% increase at most, $3 extra a month to get rid of robocallers. I don't know. I would personally spend that much money. And as you'll see in a moment, you can probably make it quite a bit less. So $3. I read in some article, the average American makes or receives 6 calls a day. That seems a lot to me, but let's run with that. Symmetry, that's 3 calls a day, 90 calls a month. At $3 for 90 calls, that's 3.3 cents per call of tolerable cost. Now, that's not a wide range between these two things. It's a single order of magnitude. But at the same time, I don't think, and this gap wasn't big enough, in my opinion, to make it by itself viable. But the reality is they don't actually want to charge everyone for calling me. If you combine this, as with many of these techniques, with other things, it works much better. And in particular, if you introduce a challenge response mechanism and you only request payment for someone I don't know, then you only end up incurring this cost for the introduction calls from someone I don't know, that I either don't trust by reputation, they're not on my contact list, they're not on my white list, I haven't called them, whatever other things have applied first. If all of those fail, then as last resort, you challenge them. And in that case, you can imagine, well, all right, next slide. What if it's only, say, 1 in 10 people or 1 in 100 people that I get a call from that I have no other record of who this is. In that percentage, you get, the cost of a single call to a consumer could be 100 times higher at 300.3 cents per call, as it's a once in 100 case. So next slide, when you map it out on a nice graph, you've got to keep the cost you incur to a caller for one of these introduction calls less than, say, 300.3 cents, probably a lot less. And you want to keep the cost to the spammer more than 0.19 cents, ideally quite a bit more. At 0.38, they're out of business completely. That's actually a huge range, by the way. It's like, it's almost 3 orders of magnitude. So that gave me hope that there's something here. And again, it is different from, I know someone sent me an article like, oh, you know, we looked at this with email spam and it didn't work. Sure, you have to look at the economics for each industry separately. And so I may have some of this wrong, and I would love your feedback to make the analysis better. If it turns out that this doesn't work, then it doesn't work. But my back of the envelope says this actually is pretty interesting for our industry to think about. So next slide. Then there's the big question of how to create the cost. And so, you know, proof of work is the proposal in the draft. I will note, like, although it says, you know, SIPcoin and whatever, there's not a proper blockchain in this. Actually, it does proof of work. It uses CAs to do attestation of proof of work. It does not do a consensus blockchain because it's not necessary. Again, so this makes the problem much simpler. We're not trying to solve a problem that hard. We just got to do proof of computation where you can demonstrate, do the work before the call, and then demonstrate the work during the call. That's the only problem we have to solve. And that is the technology described in the document. Fair enough, yes, it will burn compute. I assert if you go look at it, well, you know, the good guys almost never need to do it. It's only for introduction calls. The bad guys get disincented. They won't do it much. Like, and I'll go do an analysis on the actual like energy burn. I doubt it's actually that significant. So that may be viable, but there's other techniques too. Proof of stake has been mentioned. There's actually direct payment to trusted CAs. Maybe literally you have to send 30 cents to Let's Encrypt, and Let's Encrypt asserts that the 30 cents has been received, and that gives you permission to make the call. We're going to actually have a global security charity that also stops robocallers. I think that's pretty interesting too. So these are some ideas. This is clearly not baked. This clearly needs more thinking and better analysis. We have some time today in the lunch discussion, Hilton meeting rooms 1 through 4, to discuss this and related ideas about this stuff. So we can, how much time do I have left of my total 20 minutes? 5 minutes on this topic or 5 minutes total?
5 minutes till the session's over.
Oh, crap. Don't get in the line. I thought this was going to be quick. At lunch, next slides, because this is the one, well, we'll talk about it at lunch too. Because the other one is a more, I'd say slightly more serious proposal, a little less crazy. I'll just try and tee up the problem statement, and we can talk more about it at lunch as well.
What's that one? Callback?
Yeah.
All right, so now I got to get you this. And here.
All right. All right. So again, I'm a relative newbie to Stir, went and looked at the stuff and sort of saw an architecture that looked roughly like this. We want, no, go back.
This, it went into automatic, sorry.
That's all right.
Oh, really fast.
Yeah, so that's a good way to do it. I've seen talks like that where literally the slides auto advance. That's a way to keep it fun. All right. It's fine. That's fine. So the current Star architecture is effectively a three-party technology, which means for it to work, you need the originating domain to implement some stuff. You need the terminating domain to implement some stuff. And in fact, all of the hard work is in the third thing, which is the CAs and databases that power the whole thing. And to me, anything, the complexity of the technology is at least exponentially related to the number of entities that need to be coordinating to deploy that technology, especially when one of them has a lot of complexity in it. And in fact, this conversation we just had from Eric on sort of the certificates and questions about whose CAs do you trust and how we're going to issue these certs and how you're going to verify the numbers in them and how's it's going to work in each country and are we going to put phone numbers? We're going to put carrier codes. If we put carrier codes, how do you verify those carrier codes? And what's a database to verify that? It's like, that's all the hard stuff. In the same way we sort of went through this with Enum, like this seemed to be sort of repercussions of similar problems, is like the DNS query ain't the problem. The problem is how you get the database populated and verify its authenticity, whatever. That was completely insurmountable. Now, I think this looks better, and clearly we're making progress to the hard work of some of the folks in this room. But we want global worldwide deployment of this thing. And that's a serious question. Are we going to be able to solve this easily for calls from, small European countries to the US? And how's that all going to work? So I said, well, simplification is about eliminating dependencies. Can we come up with a solution that doesn't necessarily require a centralized CA or telco database phone number to, OCM mappings. And there's lots of use cases for that. And this is what I mean about the long tail. So, again, even if Martin and, Chris and others in their respective carriers deploy this thing, there's something like 3,000, I think is what you said, John, Lex, in the US. Like, how do each of them get involved in this thing? How do they get their CAs issued? All that kind of good stuff. International calls, long tail providers, business to business calls where it's enterprises connecting to each other. How does all of that work? And so what's in this draft, next slides, is a very simple idea of an old technique that we've been using many times, which is to do a distributed trust model where each terminating domain has its own cache of certificates and phone numbers associated with those certificates that it trusts, and it populates that cache with a reverse callback. And just in order to not annoy the user, next slide, the reverse callback has a SIP extension that blocks the call at the, it doesn't ring the phone, returns some response codes to say whether or not this return call went to the same place that issued the call. So the technology is not interesting. It's like, and we can work on it, it's not complicated. But again, the core thing to understand is this conceptual model of, instead of relying on a centralized database or CAs or whatever, I build up my own database of trust by doing reverse callbacks to check. This is more or less the foundation of much of modern identity. Anything that uses an SMS or whatever is doing similar type of techniques. Now, that said, last slide before Martin gets all upset at the mic, I do view this as complementary to RFC 8226. I mean, that's clearly the right long-term architecture. So the question for me is, how do we fill in the holes? So in cases where they're not able to get these certificates, can a enterprise that receives a call that doesn't have one of these beautiful 8226 certs, it can go and it can do the reverse callback to verify the call. And as we get more and more 8226, we need less and less callbacks. This is, so it's for entities that can't get the certs, it's for businesses that can't do these things. It fills in the gaps. So I view it as largely a complement. And also, to discuss with John, this interesting idea of even issuing certificates based on these callbacks in this distributed fashion, similar to the STIR draft. So, Martin.
Okay, Martin Dolly. Well, there's still quite a few, TDM phones out there.
Yeah.
And even where there's not, unless they're, at least in the US, unless there's a lot of regulation reform, you're still going to have this bloody IP, TDM, IP.
Yeah.
Right. So you're going to hit these PSTN gateways is the bottom line.
Yep.
These PSTN gateways, and some of the argument is that, well, they touch SIP, so therefore you can touch the code. The answer is no. And so therefore, when you send that invite in the backward direction, it's going to look like another call setup, to the calling party.
Yeah.
So how would you address that?
Well, that's what the require header is, to block that from happening. And in essence, this suffers the same challenge as STIR in band. It won't work with any kind of PSTN gateway in the middle. I don't think it's any worse or better than STIR in band in that regard.
And, just again, blood pressure medication in place. Yes. It's possible you could even try out of band strategies for this that use the CPS and precisely, we put the token in speculatively. And if it turns out that the person you're calling supports this mechanism, they could go check the CPS and it would bootstrap in precisely the way you're describing, go through those gateways perfectly, would it not?
Yeah. I think that's worth thinking about, John.
This was Jonathan and I's dinner last night, was us figuring out how to, yes.
Chris Wendt, just one quick comment. I think the premise that CAs is a hard thing. For me, CAs is sort of the simple thing. It's the regulatory and legal and blocking calls, and what are the repercussions of doing that is the hard thing. The technology for STIR, I think, is pretty straightforward.
Sorry, yeah, I should be clear. Thank you, Chris. I'm not referring to the literal, usage of the ACME protocol and the issuance certificates. It's the policy about whether or not I can legitimately assert that I own a telephone number, and which CAs are legitimately able to do those, and how do you make sure I correctly populate those lists of numbers and properly account for number portability, and how long do I have to remove it from the certificate? Well, that's an interesting question. If number ports happen in a day, so my cert lifetimes have to be reduced. That's the kind of crap I mean. That's hard, and it isn't just a US problem. So getting all that working worldwide seems hard. That's what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think where we put those root certificates, we can figure that out, but it's going to be based on the legal structure of each country and things like that. And I think that's the harder part than knowing where to look to get those certificates. So I think it's a legal problem, not a technology problem.
Okay.
I mean, so, right. John Peterson again, as I said in the list, I mean, any database, centralized or decentralized, could end up being regulated in any given country, right, in the world. I don't think that that's, I mean, it's a risk it's hard for us to hedge against, right? I don't think we can predict that. That much said, as I also put on the list, like certificates have had telephone numbers in them for a long time, and it doesn't make it a telco database if you have a cert with the telephone number in it. I think there are a lot of cases where there's room for trying to do ad hoc things like this to bootstrap us. My concern about this is much more, let's make sure if we're going to do something that is a bootstrapping mechanism, it moves the ball closer to the 8226 world that we all want, and that there's a clear kind of incremental upgrade path to it from this. And I think there's a way to do this. It actually does have that property. And that where, you know, I mean, it could literally end up generating certs that would be integratable into this, like going forward. So
Yeah, just make it clear. I am not opposed to thinking about other ideas, and obviously, I'm interested in technology. So that from that perspective, I was just mentioning about the premise of the CAs being hard.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have more time during the lunch session, I think. So what was the 5 minutes ago? That started 5 minutes ago, so I should go over there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've seen you pay 100 years. Am I wrong?
Oh, yeah. Easy. We're getting know that.